Hello and welcome back. As you can see, I have Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio loaded up, and this can mean only one thing, that today we're going to be working with practice. We're going to actually be putting all the knowledge we've learned into practice through writing our queries. So I hope you're very excited about it. Before we go any further though, let's check that we have everything the same. As you can see, I have the consumer complaints database loaded up, and inside of it I have a table called consumer complaints. So if we go ahead and just right click on it to select top 1000 rows, this should give us enough information whether the table has appropriate information and the data inside of it is correct. And as you can see, if we just scroll down on the results tab, everything looks fine and normal. So let's go ahead, close this query, and start writing our own queries with our own hands without needing the help from the Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio. So first thing first, you want to either press Ctrl N or just left click this button right here that says new query. And inside of here, the first task we're going to do is that we want to select every single row inside of this database. We want to display all the data that's contained inside this table called consumer complaints. As you know, we can either go ahead and say select and just open this columns up and then start typing all of them one by one. So date received, and then comma, then product name, and then comma, then subproduct, comma, issue, comma, and so on. Or alternatively, instead of typing it all ourselves, what we can do is just drag and drop, put comma. Don't worry about the brackets. You can write it both ways, in brackets or without. The SQL just Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio just puts these brackets here when you drag and drop to identify where the table came from, but because we're only working with one table, it's not important. So right now we can just drag and drop, separate them by comma, and I'll speed up this process so you're not stuck with me doing this. So I'll see you in a bit. So as you can see right now, I have all the columns written down, and it took me quite a while to just drag and drop them. As you can see, mostly I just drag and drop them instead of writing them, and still it took a lot of time, and I could have easily made a mistake by either not dragging one of them out or duplicating some of the columns. And just to finish with this query, let's go ahead and write our second part of select statement, where we select it from. In our case, it's consumer complaints. So again, you can either start typing it and type it all yourself, or you can select it from the drop-down menu. In our case, it's not the database, it's the table, or you can just drag and drop it from this screen right here. In my case, I'll just use the down arrow, press enter, and it will work. Again, let's execute it, and as you can see, we have everything displayed correctly, appropriately. There seems to be no mistakes. All of the columns are presented correctly in the correct order, and as you can see, we have 65,500 rows. So everything works perfectly fine, but let's just quickly zoom out here, and you can see the size of this query is just insane. Imagine if you had to write all of that down yourself, or imagine if you have 40, 50, 100 columns in your table, in your database. Obviously that will not happen a lot, and that should never happen, that you have such absurd amount of columns in any given table, but just imagine if you do. In this case, you don't want to be writing them all one by one out. So as you can already guess, there is another way of typing it in SQL, because you're working with big chunks, big amounts of data all the time. So instead of writing all of that, all that we could have written is select star, and select star gives us exactly the same results as selecting every single column one by one. So again, let's copy this. So we're gonna do select star, Control A, Control C, and then let's just Control Z a couple ways back. And as you can see, this is our initial query. Now let's run a new query in which we'll just say select all from consumer complaints. It gives us exactly the same amount of columns, exactly the same information in exactly the same order, and it gives us everything correctly. The only thing is that instead of writing all of this down, instead of having to worry about if we've made any mistakes or not, we just can simply type in select all. So now I hope you understand the most common select query, where you have to select all of the data from a table. And now let's move on to something more interesting. Let's just close this query. Let's close this query. Just if you want to save them, go ahead, save them. This menu will pop up. You can choose where to save them. In my case, I don't think we need to save such simple queries, such fundamental queries. So let's just open a new query window. And inside of it, I'll just zoom in a bit so it's easier for you to see. And inside of it, let's work with specific data. So for example, let's say I don't want to display every single column inside this table. I only want to see the product, the issue this product had, and the company that produced the product. So in this case, of course, I need the select. So now instead of writing down all the columns, and then looking at them from the table and trying to just scroll through the table and pick the columns we need, we just can understand that all we need is product name. Again, just dragging and dropping, very easily made in Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio. Alternatively, we can write it down. So for example, we need to select product name, then we need to select issue, and then we need to select company name. So there we go, company, just company. As it's written here. So now if we finish writing this select query, all we have to do is select all of these 3 columns from consumer complaints table. So just select this one and let's run it. As you can see, now it gives us a way more manageable view of the same database just because there's only 3 columns selected. And it gives us all the correct information, and I would say that from this table, this is probably the most important information you will be working with. Of course, you can work with a lot more data, and we will work with a lot more data and combinations of different columns, trying to find specific patterns and specific issues or any anomalies with data. But this is just like in any company that you would go, most of the time they want to find an issue with the data, and that's just done by simply writing this small query. After that, we will learn how to manipulate it to get results shortened down. But for now, I think this is a very good result. It's your first time writing a query in Microsoft SQL, and you already perform the most fundamental, the most powerful, the most important tasks that any company can have. So now, just to make sure we understand what we want to do, let's go ahead and just delete this top row, because we're obviously going to be working with consumer complaints for this lecture and for the whole rest of this section. And inside of it, this select statement, let's try to select something else. For example, let's see what the product was, what was the subproduct, what was the issue, and what was the state that it all came from. So in this case, again, what do we need? The key elements of this query: product, subproduct, issue, and state name. In our case, the columns are written in a very understandable fashion. So if we want product, we just have to drag product name here, put a comma, then drag the subproduct in here as well, just separate them by space, then put a comma, drive in issue, and then put a comma and drive in state name. So in other tables or in more advanced examples or tasks, what you might need to do, you might need to understand that which columns represent what, or maybe a combination of some columns represent something else, and then you will have a bit more difficult time with identifying the key elements. But with any SQL query you will ever be working with, as long as you identify the key elements, as I like to call them, the stuff you need to find and the stuff you have to work with and the stuff where you have to work it from, you should be alright. Everything else is just logical. You have to take logical steps that you need to combine this or shorten this, or maybe just narrow the search results down. So coming back to our example, as you can see, we have select product name, subproduct, issue, and state name. Let's run it. As you can see, it gives us no mistake. Also, you can already notice that some fields in the subproduct column are empty. Nothing to worry about. As you can see, a lot of products will never even have an opportunity to have a subproduct, or maybe the people that put them in the database just put them as void, didn't bother to put them in, or put them with initially some mistake that had to be eradicated later on. These fields called nulls, and we'll be working with them later on in this course, but they're nothing to worry about. Nulls are very common in SQL in pretty much any database you come up with. So I hope this lecture made you understand SQL better, and most importantly drove your fear of queries, if you had any, away, because as you can see, programming languages are very logical. SQL is not different. All you need to understand is what you need to find and what elements you need to use in order to get those results, and then you just need to add different tools. And we're going to be teaching you all the tools, all the different functions, all the different statements, all the different tricks and tips. So again, don't worry if you think SQL is difficult, if you think you will have any issues. You won't. It's very logical. If you do everything right, you will get the correct result 100% of the time. If you do something wrong, it's very easy to go back and fix it. And I hope you enjoyed this lecture. It's very interesting to be actually working inside the Microsoft SQL Management Studio. It's refreshing, and I think it's always better to practice more rather than just sit through theory without having any real world data to work with. And as always, I hope you enjoyed today's lecture, and I'll see you in the next one.